Roy Wood Jr. had some really interesting comments about journalism over the weekend at the White House Correspondents Dinner. Here's what he had to say about the part that journalism played in American history.
My mother was amongst a group of black student protesters fighting for equality in the 60s. Those types of incidents were covered by local reporters, and some of the shame that came from the national embarrassment of treating people inhumanely is part of the pressure that helped to create that type of change. What would have become of my mother and those other protesters if a local journalist wasn't there telling the story? My mother's journey may not have even begun if not for brave journalists who chose to chronicle history in real time.
So that was a great set, and I watched it in lieu of my weekly SNL Sunday night marathon. But that clip was really difficult for me to watch because he mentions protesters and he brings in the history of black soldiers in Vietnam, and he alludes to the influence of black communities in making sure that the civil rights that black soldiers fought for were extended to the people who fought for those rights. But what the early civil rights movement couldn't have known is that not just skin color and race could be a site of indignity and inhumanity, but your military service could as well. Beginning in the 70s, we have news reports of soldiers being spit on. And at the time, it was just kind of brushed off. But now we have a military suicide epidemic. We don't think about whether there is inhumane treatment, undignified treatment, unequal treatment of military families, soldiers, and veterans. There is, because it's going unreported. The journalists who were so brave to cover some of these issues in the 60s and into the 70s, that courage seems to have waned. I don't know where the journalists are who should be covering the 800 plus veterans who have filed complaints of employment discrimination under a law called VEVRA, or the fact that the Department of Labor's own enforcement data shows that they're disproportionately denying veterans those complaints. In other words, the Department of Labor is not believing veterans when they file employment discrimination complaints. The law in question, VEVRA, doesn't even cover all veterans. It excludes 20% of the veteran population. And so I want to know where those journalists are who were once so brave but now can't find it in themselves to cover veteran employment discrimination. There's all these weird Swiss cheese protections that soldiers and veterans and military families are supposed to receive, but they're not. And they're not getting any attention. Nobody's talking about it because the journalist that Roy Wood talked about, his own father and other journalists who are sitting in that White House Correspondents' Dinner, don't have the courage to do an inconvenient story about a minority population that is killing itself. Just because they're a minority does not mean they should not receive the protections that they already have under law. In housing, in education, we have no protections. Even though we are the people that fought to secure these protections for other communities, we don't receive the same protections themselves. And so this weekend, it was really hard to watch Roy Wood's otherwise incredible set at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, because I know that a bunch of those outlets in there have heard from me on multiple occasions. You can find the employment discrimination complaint data on the Department of Labor's own website. They don't even hide it. That's how ridiculously inhumane this is. The DOL can advertise their own disproportionate denial of rights to veterans, and journalists aren't going to cover it. The agencies aren't going to enforce it because they don't have enough money to do it. And meanwhile, the people who lose are the people who are fighting to otherwise make sure all of you get the same protections that we are getting denied. And so I'm angry, just as I'm sure Roy Wood's mom was angry when she protested, as I'm sure that his dad, when he created the Press Association, I'm sure he was angry too. And I know that the more I'm angry, the more civilians can say he's just another angry veteran. It's so clear and obvious, but nobody's talking about it because the people that it affects don't have the microphone. They don't have the power to positively affect their own political standing. And so it's up to journalists, it's up to civilians to do things, to talk about things, not because it's convenient for them, not because they're getting paid to or not paid to, but because it's the right thing. I'm going to continue to get marginalized as a veteran, as a member of a military family, until the people with power, civilians, especially in Congress and in federal agencies, until they start doing the right thing and start doing their job in the same way that I did my job. My job was to secure these rights for other people. Now it's our nation's job to get rid of the national embarrassment that is military suicide by closing the loopholes, strengthening the enforcement, and making sure that nobody else falls through these gaping cracks that are left by ignorance, inattention, disregard, and everything else. It's a longer video than I wanted, but I think it's important. I'm calling out all the news organizations. I'm calling out all the federal agencies that have a dog in this fight and are keeping it on the leash or keeping it in the fucking doghouse, because I'm tired of it. We need civilians who are willing to do the right thing even when it's inconvenient, and I hope that's each and every one of you who watch this video. Back at the beginning, Woods asked a question. He said, what would have become of my mother and those black protesters had a local journalist not been there to tell the story? And the question that I have, I suppose, is where are those journalists as the story of military suicide and employment discrimination are unfolding? The question is what we as a society are willing to do about it. And my question to journalists is, where the fuck are you? This has been going on for years. I know because I've been bringing it to many of those outlets' attention. But where are you? Why aren't you telling the story of our nation's heroes who are being denied their rights and the connections, the implications that it has for what new approaches we might take to the epidemic of military suicide?